The train wheels clicked against the iron rails as Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face to the dusty window. Outside, the endless prairie stretched toward distant mountains that looked purple in the afternoon light. She had been traveling for 3 days now, leaving behind the crowded streets of Boston for something she hoped would be better. Margaret clutched her teaching certificate in her worn leather bag. At 23, she had finally saved enough money to travel west and start fresh. The letter from the Cedar Falls school superintendent had promised a good position teaching children in a growing Montana town. After everything that had happened back east, this felt like her only chance at a new beginning. The train began to slow, and Margaret's heart started beating faster. Through the window, she could see wooden buildings scattered along a main street. A few horses stood tied to posts outside what looked like a general store. This was it, Cedar Falls, Montana, her new home. As the train came to a complete stop, Margaret gathered her 2 bags and stepped carefully down onto the wooden platform. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, mixed with dust and something she couldn't name. Maybe freedom. She looked around, expecting to see someone from the school waiting for her. The superintendent's letter had mentioned that someone would meet her at the station, but the platform was nearly empty except for a few other passengers and some local folks. Then she noticed him. A tall man was walking toward her, holding a bunch of wildflowers that looked like he had picked them himself. He was probably in his early 30s, with brown hair that needed a haircut, and clothes that were clean but clearly meant for working outdoors. His boots were scuffed and his hands looked rough, but his eyes were kind. He stopped in front of her and took off his hat. "Miss Catherine?" he asked, his voice hopeful but uncertain. "I'm Samuel Hayes. I've been waiting for you." Margaret blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I'm Margaret O'Sullivan, not Catherine. I'm here to teach at the school." Samuel's face fell slightly and he looked down at the flowers in his hands. "You're not Catherine Miller? The woman who answered my advertisement for a wife?" Now Margaret understood. This man was expecting a mail-order bride, and somehow he thought she was the woman he had been writing to. "No, I'm definitely not her. I'm the new school teacher, or at least I was supposed to be." Samuel looked embarrassed and started to back away. "I'm real sorry to bother you, miss. I just thought, well, Catherine was supposed to arrive today, and when I saw you getting off the train—" "Wait," Margaret said, suddenly worried. "Did you say you were expecting someone today?" "Because I was supposed to meet someone from the school, but I don't see anyone here." Samuel scratched his head and looked around the platform. "Well, there's old Pete who works at the station. Maybe he knows something." He called over to an elderly man who was loading bags onto a cart. "Hey, Pete, did anyone from the school come by today looking for a new teacher?" Pete walked over, wiping his hands on his overalls. "You mean Miss O'Sullivan?" "Yes, someone came by this morning asking about her. Turns out they hired someone else last week. Some woman whose husband already lived here. Guess they forgot to send word back east." Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. "They forgot to send word? But I traveled all this way. I spent almost all my money on the train ticket." Pete shrugged. "Sorry, miss. That's what the man told me. Said to tell you if you showed up that they were real sorry about the mix-up." Margaret sank down onto her larger bag, feeling dizzy. This couldn't be happening. She had less than $5 left in her purse. Not nearly enough for a ticket back to Boston, even if she wanted to return to that life. Which she definitely didn't. Samuel was still standing there, turning his hat around in his hands. He seemed to be thinking hard about something. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss O'Sullivan, I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, but I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds like you're in a bit of trouble." Margaret looked up at him. His face was serious, but those kind eyes made her feel like maybe he actually cared about her problem. "I suppose I am. I can't afford to go back east, and apparently there's no job here for me." "Well," Samuel said slowly, "I've got a proposition. Nothing improper, you understand. But I live on a ranch about 5 miles outside town, and I could use some help around the house. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. My last housekeeper moved away to live with her daughter, and I'm not much good at keeping house myself." Margaret studied his face, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick, but Samuel looked sincere, even worried that he might be offending her. "I'd pay fair wages," he continued quickly. "And you'd have your own room, of course. Just until you figure out what you want to do next. I know it's not teaching, but it would give you time to maybe write to other schools or find something else." Margaret thought about her options. She could sit here on this platform and feel sorry for herself, or she could accept help from this stranger who seemed decent enough. Back in Boston, taking a job as a housekeeper for an unmarried man would have caused a scandal. But this wasn't Boston, and she was tired of living by other people's rules. "Mr. Hayes," she said, standing up and brushing dust off her skirt, "I think I'd like to accept your offer, at least for now." Samuel's face broke into a smile that made him look younger. "Really? That's wonderful. I mean, that'll work out real well for both of us." He seemed to remember the flowers in his hands and looked at them sadly. I guess Catherine took the wrong train or changed her mind. "Maybe she'll still show up," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure why she was trying to comfort this man about another woman. "Maybe," Samuel agreed, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "Well, let me get your bags and we'll head out to the ranch. I've got a wagon waiting." As Samuel loaded her belongings into a sturdy wooden wagon pulled by 2 brown horses, Margaret looked back at the train station. This morning she had been Margaret O'Sullivan, failed schoolteacher with nowhere to go. Now she was Margaret O'Sullivan, housekeeper on a cattle ranch. It wasn't what she had planned, but maybe that was okay. The ride to Samuel's ranch took about an hour, and Margaret found herself relaxing as they left the town behind. The landscape was so different from anything she had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in grass that moved like waves in the wind. Here and there, cattle grazed peacefully. The sky seemed bigger here, stretching endlessly in all directions. Samuel wasn't much of a talker, but he pointed out landmarks along the way. "That's Willow Creek," he said as they crossed a small bridge. "Never runs dry, even in the worst summers. And over there, those are my neighbor's horses. Good people, the Andersons." As they topped a small hill, Margaret got her first look at what would be her new home, at least for now. The ranch house sat in a valley surrounded by gentle slopes. It was bigger than she had expected, built from logs but with a wide front porch and large windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Behind the house, she could see a barn and several smaller buildings. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and meant it. Samuel looked pleased. "My father built the house and I've added on some over the years. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable." As they pulled up in front of the house, an older man came out of the barn. He was probably in his 60s with gray hair and a friendly face. "That's Dutch," Samuel explained. "He's been working here since before I was born. Helped my father build this place." Dutch walked over to the wagon, grinning when he saw Margaret. "Well, I'll be. This must be the bride you've been expecting." "Actually, Dutch, this is Miss O'Sullivan. She's going to be our new housekeeper." Long story, but Catherine didn't make it on today's train. Dutch raised his eyebrows but didn't ask questions. Instead, he tipped his hat to Margaret. "Pleased to meet you, miss. I hope you'll be happy here." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I hope so too." Samuel helped her down from the wagon and carried her bags to the front porch. "Let me show you around inside and then you can get settled in your room." The inside of the house was even nicer than Margaret had expected. The main room had a large stone fireplace and comfortable furniture. The kitchen was well equipped with a good stove and plenty of counter space. Everything was clean but had that slightly neglected look that houses get when they're missing a woman's touch. "Your room is upstairs," Samuel said, leading her up a staircase made from the same logs as the walls. "It's got a nice view of the hills and there's a washstand and everything you'll need." The bedroom was simple but pleasant, with a quilt-covered bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. Margaret set down her bags and looked out at the view. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, painted gold by the setting sun. "It's lovely," she said. "Thank you for this, Mr. Hayes. I really don't know what I would have done." Samuel stood in the doorway, seeming unsure whether to come in or stay out. "Call me Samuel, please. And you don't need to thank me. Like I said, I need the help around here." After Samuel left her to get settled, Margaret sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been on a train, nervous but excited about her new teaching job. Now she was sitting in a bedroom on a cattle ranch working for a man she had just met, a man who had been expecting to marry someone else. She unpacked her few belongings. Margaret woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. The ranch, Samuel, her new job as a housekeeper. She could hear voices and the sound of boots on the wooden porch below. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress and pinned her brown hair back neatly. When she came downstairs, she found Samuel and Dutch at the kitchen table drinking coffee from large mugs. "Good morning," Samuel said, standing up when he saw her. I hope we didn't wake you. We usually start early around here. Good morning, Margaret replied. What time is it? About 6, Dutch said with a grin. City folks aren't used to ranch hours, I expect. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I don't mind getting up early. I just need to learn the routine. Samuel poured her a cup of coffee. No routine yet. That's part of the problem. We've been batching it for months now, just eating whatever we can throw together. Margaret looked around the kitchen. It was clean enough, but she could see it needed a woman's organization. The cupboards probably needed sorting, and there was no sign of any meal planning. Why don't you show me what food you have? She suggested, and I'll plan some proper meals. For the next hour, Samuel and Dutch showed her around the house and explained how things worked. The pump in the kitchen brought up water from the well. The root cellar kept vegetables fresh. The smokehouse behind the barn held preserved meat. There was even a small garden that had been neglected since the last housekeeper left. Rebecca was getting on in years, Dutch explained as they walked through the overgrown garden. Her daughter in Denver wanted her to come live there, and we couldn't ask her to stay. Margaret knelt down and pulled some weeds away from what looked like potato plants. This could be productive again with some work. You know about gardening? Samuel asked, sounding surprised. My grandmother had a garden behind our house in Boston. Small, but she grew enough vegetables to help feed the family. Margaret stood up and brushed dirt off her hands. I helped her from the time I was little. Samuel and Dutch exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't read. Then Samuel said, well, if you want to work on it, feel free. I'm afraid Dutch and I don't know much about growing anything except grass for the cattle. After the men left to work with the cattle, Margaret spent the morning exploring the house more thoroughly. It was larger than she had realized the night before. Besides the main living area and kitchen downstairs, there were 4 bedrooms upstairs and a small study that Samuel apparently used for keeping his business records. The house had good bones, as her grandmother would have said. It was well built and comfortable, but it needed the kind of attention that only came from someone who cared about making it a real home. Margaret found herself thinking about small changes that would make it more welcoming. Curtains for some of the windows. Perhaps some flowers in jars on the tables. She made a list of supplies she would need from town and started planning meals for the week. There was plenty of meat, both fresh and preserved, and the root cellar had potatoes, onions, and other vegetables that were still good. She could make hearty, satisfying meals that would keep the men well fed during their long days of physical work. By noon, she had bread rising on the kitchen counter and a pot of soup simmering on the stove. When Samuel and Dutch came in for lunch, they stopped in the doorway and just stared. Something smells incredible, Dutch said. Margaret ladled soup into bowls and sliced fresh bread. It's just vegetable soup, nothing fancy. But when the men tasted it, their faces lit up. This is wonderful, Samuel said. I can't remember the last time I had soup this good. Rebecca was a fine cook, Dutch added, but this is something special. Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction. She had always enjoyed cooking, but back in Boston she had rarely had the chance to cook for people who truly appreciated it. Her former fiancé had expected elaborate meals but never thanked her for them. After lunch, Samuel lingered in the kitchen while Dutch went back to work. Miss O'Sullivan, he began, then stopped. Actually, would it be all right if I called you Margaret? Miss O'Sullivan seems awfully formal for someone living in the same house. Of course, Margaret said, and I'll call you Samuel like you asked. Samuel nodded, seeming pleased. Margaret, I wanted to ask you something. Do you ride? Horses? Margaret shook her head. I've never had the opportunity. Would you like to learn? There are some beautiful places on the ranch that are too far to walk to, and it might be useful if you ever needed to get to town quickly. Margaret thought about it. The idea was both frightening and exciting. I suppose I could try. Samuel's face lit up. Good, we'll start with Buttercup. She's gentle as a lamb and patient with beginners. That afternoon, Samuel brought a sweet-tempered mare to the corral behind the barn. Buttercup was golden brown with a white stripe down her nose, and she stood quietly while Samuel explained how to approach a horse safely. Always let her see you coming, he said. Horses don't like surprises. And keep your voice calm and steady. Margaret was nervous at first, but Samuel was a patient teacher. He showed her how to brush the horse, how to put on the saddle, and how to hold the reins properly. When she finally climbed onto Buttercup's back, she felt like she was sitting on top of the world. Just sit easy, Samuel said, walking beside the horse as she took her first steps. Let her do the work. You're just along for the ride. After an hour of walking around the corral, Margaret felt confident enough to venture outside the fence. Samuel rode his own horse, a big black gelding named Thunder, and they took a slow tour of the ranch. From horseback, Margaret could see the full scope of Samuel's property. Rolling hills covered with grass stretched for miles. Cattle grazed peacefully in groups, and she could see the silver ribbon of Willow Creek winding through the valley. "It's beautiful," she said, pulling Buttercup to a stop on top of a small hill. "How long has your family owned all this?" "My father homesteaded here about 30 years ago," Samuel said. "It was just wild prairie then. He built the house, dug the well, started the herd from scratch. When I was growing up, we had neighbors scattered all around, but some moved on when the winters got hard or the cattle prices fell. Don't you get lonely out here?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking out over the hills. "Sometimes. That's why He stopped and looked embarrassed. "Why you sent for a mail-order bride?" Margaret finished gently. "Yes. I figured it was time to get married. Start a family. But I don't get to town much, and there aren't many unmarried women around here anyway." He glanced at her, then quickly looked away. I guess it seemed like a practical solution. Margaret thought about the word practical. It sounded so cold, so different from the kind of marriage she had always dreamed of. What was she like? Catherine, I mean. In her letters. Samuel shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. She seemed nice enough. Said she was good at cooking and sewing, wanted children, didn't mind living on a ranch. We didn't write about personal things much. Margaret tried to imagine exchanging letters with a stranger, planning to marry someone she had never met. It took courage, she realized. Both Samuel and Catherine had been brave enough to take a chance on finding happiness with someone they knew only through letters. As they rode back toward the house, Margaret found herself stealing glances at Samuel. He sat easy in the saddle, clearly at home on horseback. His hands were gentle with the reins, and he spoke softly to his horse. She was beginning to understand that beneath his quiet, serious exterior, Samuel was a man who cared deeply about the things and people in his life. That evening, after Dutch had gone to his own small cabin near the barn, Margaret and Samuel sat on the front porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink that she had never seen in the city. "Tell me about Boston," Samuel said. "What was your life like there?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell him. "I lived with my aunt after my parents died. She was kind but very concerned about proper behavior. I worked as a governess for a wealthy family, teaching their children. Did you like it?" "I loved the teaching part. The children were bright and eager to learn. But the family treated me like a servant, not a teacher. And my aunt was always pushing me to find a husband and settle down." "But you didn't want to get married?" Margaret sighed. "I was engaged once. To a man my aunt thought was suitable. He was successful, well-connected, everything she thought I should want. What happened? I realized that he didn't want a wife. He wanted someone to manage his household and look pretty at his business dinners. He had opinions about everything I should do, say, think, even what I should read." Margaret's voice grew bitter. "When I told him I wanted to keep teaching after we married, he laughed and said I wouldn't need to fill my head with such nonsense once I had a proper home to manage." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "That's why you came west. To get away from him. To get away from all of it. The expectations, the rules about how a woman should behave. The idea that I couldn't make my own choices." Margaret looked out at the vast expanse of prairie. "Out here it feels like there's room to be myself." "And what is yourself like?" Samuel asked quietly. Margaret smiled. "I'm still figuring that out." Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the wagon coming up the road. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and Samuel and Dutch were out moving cattle to the winter pasture. She shaded her eyes with her hand and looked toward the main road, wondering who might be coming to visit. As the wagon got closer, she could see it was Pete from the train station driving. And there was a woman sitting beside him, a young woman with blonde hair and a traveling dress that looked expensive even from a distance. Margaret's heart began to pound as she realized who this must be. Catherine Miller, Samuel's mail-order bride, had finally arrived. She stood frozen by the clothesline, watching as Pete helped the woman down from the wagon and carried her bags to the front porch. The woman was pretty. Margaret could see that even from across the yard. She was small and delicate-looking, exactly the kind of woman men seemed to prefer. Pete knocked on the front door, and when no one answered, he called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" I've got Miss Catherine Miller here." Margaret forced herself to walk over to the wagon. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. I work here as the housekeeper." Catherine turned to look at her, and Margaret saw that she was indeed very pretty. She had blue eyes and pale skin, and her blonde hair was perfectly arranged despite the long journey. She looked like she had stepped out of a ladies' magazine. "Oh," Catherine said, seeming confused. "I was expecting to meet Mr. Hayes, Samuel Hayes. He sent for me to be his... That is, we correspond about marriage," Margaret finished. "Yes, I know. Samuel isn't here right now, but he should be back by afternoon. Please come inside. You must be tired from your journey." Pete helped carry Catherine's bags into the house, accepted a cup of coffee and a piece of cake, then headed back to town. Margaret found herself alone with the woman who was supposed to take her place in this house. "This is a lovely home," Catherine said, looking around the main room. "Much nicer than I expected from Samuel's letters." He made it sound quite rustic. "Samuel is modest about what he's accomplished here," Margaret said, feeling defensive on his behalf. "He and his father built this ranch from nothing." Catherine nodded, but she seemed more interested in examining the furniture and decorations than talking about Samuel's achievements. "And you say you're the housekeeper? How long have you been working here?" "About 3 months," Margaret said. "I came west to teach school, but the position had been filled. Samuel was kind enough to offer me work here." "How convenient for him," Catherine said with a little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A man living alone does need someone to keep house." There was something in Catherine's tone that made Margaret uncomfortable, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "Can I get you anything? Some lunch, perhaps? You must be hungry." "That would be lovely. Nothing too elaborate, of course. I don't want to put you to trouble." Margaret went to the kitchen and began preparing a simple meal. As she worked, she could hear Catherine moving around the main room, and she wondered what the other woman was thinking. Was she pleased with what she saw? Disappointed? Excited to finally meet the man she had agreed to marry? When Margaret brought lunch to the table, Catherine was examining the books on the shelf beside the fireplace. "These are yours, I suppose?" she asked. "Some of them. Samuel has been reading them too." Catherine looked surprised. "Really? He never mentioned in his letters that he was a reader. In fact, he gave me the impression that he was a simple rancher without much education." "Samuel is more educated than he gives himself credit for," Margaret said. "And he's one of the most intelligent men I've ever met." "You seem quite fond of your employer," Catherine observed, sitting down at the table. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "Samuel is a good man. Anyone would respect him." Catherine ate delicately, commenting politely on the food. She seemed nervous, which was understandable. After all, she was about to meet the man she had agreed to marry based only on letters they had exchanged. "Tell me about Samuel," Catherine said. "What is he really like? I mean, letters can only tell you so much about a person." Margaret thought carefully about how to answer. "He's kind and honest. He works hard and takes care of the people who depend on him. He's quiet, but when he speaks, it's worth listening to. And he has a good sense of humor, though it takes time to see it." "Is he handsome?" Catherine asked with a little laugh. Margaret felt her face grow even warmer. Yes, I suppose he is. But that's not the most important thing about him." "Of course not," Catherine agreed. "But it doesn't hurt, does it?" They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Margaret looked out the window and saw Samuel and Dutch riding toward the house. Her heart began to race again, though she wasn't sure if it was from nervousness or something else. "That's Samuel," she told Catherine. "The tall one on the black horse." Catherine moved to the window and peered out. "Oh my," she said softly. "He's quite impressive, isn't he?" Margaret watched Samuel dismount and hand his reins to Dutch. He was dusty from working with the cattle, and his hair was mussed, but he looked strong and capable. He looked like a man who could take care of whatever life threw at him. Samuel came up the porch steps and opened the front door, calling out, "Margaret, we're back early. Is there any coffee left?" He stopped short when he saw Catherine standing in the main room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "You must be Catherine," he said finally. "Yes," Catherine said, sounding breathless. "And you're Samuel. I'm so sorry I'm late. There was a mix-up with the trains, and I ended up in Billings by mistake. It took me weeks to get everything sorted out." "No harm done," Samuel said, though he sounded uncertain. "I'm glad you made it safely." Margaret felt like she was intruding on a private moment. I'll go start dinner, she said, backing toward the kitchen. But Samuel caught her eye as she turned to leave. The look he gave her was so full of confusion and something that might have been regret that Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. In the kitchen, Margaret tried to focus on preparing dinner, but she kept hearing voices from the main room. Catherine's high, sweet laugh, Samuel's deeper voice, though she couldn't make out what he was saying, the sound of Dutch coming in to wash up for dinner. When she called them to eat, the atmosphere around the table was awkward. Catherine chattered brightly about her journey and her first impressions of Montana. Samuel answered her questions politely but didn't volunteer much conversation. Dutch tried to fill the silences with stories about the ranch and the local area. "And where will I be staying?" Catherine asked as they finished the meal. "I hope you don't think it's improper for me to ask, but I want to make sure everything is arranged correctly." Samuel looked uncomfortable. I assumed you'd want to get married right away, so I hadn't thought." "Oh, I couldn't possibly get married immediately," Catherine said with a laugh. "We barely know each other. I was hoping we could have a proper courtship first. Get to know each other as people, not just letter writers." "Of course," Samuel said, looking relieved. "That makes perfect sense. You can have the guest room upstairs. Margaret's room is at the other end of the hall, so you'll have privacy." "How thoughtful," Catherine said, smiling at Margaret. "It will be nice to have another woman in the house." After dinner, Margaret showed Catherine to her room and helped her unpack. Catherine had brought several trunks full of clothes, more than Margaret had ever owned in her life. There were dresses for every occasion, delicate undergarments trimmed with lace, and a beautiful white dress that was clearly meant to be a wedding gown. "Everything is so lovely," Margaret said, hanging up a blue silk dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly wages. "Thank you. I've been preparing for this new life for months. I wanted to make a good impression." Catherine held up a pale yellow dress. "What do you think Samuel would like? The yellow or the green?" Margaret felt a stab of something painful in her chest. "I'm sure he'd think you look beautiful in either one." "You really are sweet," Catherine said. "I can see why Samuel values you so highly." That night, Margaret lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Catherine moving around in the next room, humming softly to herself as she prepared for bed. It was a happy sound, the sound of a woman who was pleased with her new circumstances. Margaret tried to be glad for Samuel. Catherine seemed nice enough, and she was certainly everything a man could want in a wife. She was pretty and well-dressed and had come all this way to marry him. She would give him the family he wanted, the companionship he had been seeking. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The way Samuel had looked when he first saw Catherine, it wasn't the expression of a man seeing his future wife for the first time. It was the expression of a man who was surprised and maybe even a little disappointed. Over the next few days, Margaret watched Samuel and Catherine try to get to know each other. Catherine was charming and pleasant, asking interested questions about the ranch and Samuel's work. Samuel was polite and attentive, showing her around the property and explaining how everything worked. Margaret was kneading bread dough when Dr. Harrison came riding up to the house like the devil was chasing him. She wiped flour from her hands and hurried to the front door, her heart pounding at the sight of the usually calm doctor looking so frantic. "Miss O'Sullivan," he called out, dismounting quickly. "Is Samuel here? I need all the help I can get. He's out checking fences with Dutch. What's wrong?" Dr. Harrison ran a hand through his gray hair. "There's been an outbreak of diphtheria at the reservation. Started with one family, but it's spreading fast. I've got my hands full, and the tribal healer is doing what he can. But we need more people who aren't afraid to help." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Diphtheria was a killer, especially among children. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. I've already lost 2 patients, and there are at least a dozen more who are sick. The problem is, most folks in town are too scared to come near the place. Can't say I blame them, but those people need help." Margaret made her decision immediately. "I'll come. Let me get my things." "Margaret, wait." Dr. Harrison caught her arm. "You understand what you're volunteering for? This disease is highly contagious. You could get sick yourself. You could die." "I understand," Margaret said firmly, "but I have some nursing experience. My grandmother taught me about caring for the sick before she died. If people are suffering, I have to help." Dr. Harrison nodded, relief clear on his weathered face. Bless you, child. We'll need supplies. Clean cloths, soup ingredients, anything you can spare. Margaret was gathering supplies when Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway. What's all the commotion about? She asked, still in her dressing gown despite it being nearly noon. There's a diphtheria outbreak at the Indian reservation, Margaret explained, stuffing clean linens into a bag. Dr. Harrison needs help nursing the sick. Catherine's face went pale. You're not seriously thinking of going there? Margaret, that's incredibly dangerous. You could catch the disease and bring it back here. The risk is worth it if I can help save lives, Margaret said, adding a jar of honey and some herbs to her supplies. Her grandmother had always said honey could soothe inflamed throats. But what about Samuel? And the ranch? You can't just abandon your responsibilities here. Margaret paused in her packing. Catherine was right that leaving would disrupt the household. But she couldn't stand by while people suffered. The ranch will survive for a few days. Samuel and Dutch can take care of themselves. This is madness, Catherine said, backing away from Margaret as if she might already be contagious. You're risking your life for a bunch of strangers. Savages, even. Margaret turned to face Catherine, anger flashing in her eyes. They're not savages. They're people, just like us. They have children who are sick and dying. How can you call yourself a Christian and not want to help them? Catherine's chin lifted defensively. I'm being practical. Someone has to think about the consequences. What if you get sick? What if you bring the disease back to the ranch? Then I'll face those consequences when they come, Margaret said. But I won't live with myself if I don't try to help. She finished packing and carried her bags outside, where Dr. Harrison was waiting with an extra horse. Just as they were about to leave, Samuel and Dutch came riding up from the south pasture. Doc, Samuel called out, seeing the serious expressions on their faces. What's wrong? Dr. Harrison quickly explained the situation. Samuel's face grew grave as he listened, and when the doctor finished, Samuel looked directly at Margaret. You're going to help, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Margaret replied, lifting her chin and preparing for an argument. But Samuel just nodded. Good, you'll need more supplies than that. He dismounted and headed for the house. Dutch, load up some of that beef we butchered last week, and get the spare blankets from the storage room. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had expected Samuel to try to stop her, or at least to lecture her about the danger. Instead, he was helping her prepare. Catherine came out onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Samuel, surely you're not going to let Margaret go to that disease-ridden place? It's far too dangerous for a woman. Samuel turned to look at Catherine, and Margaret saw something cold in his expression. Margaret is capable of making her own decisions. And if she thinks she can help save lives, then she should go. But the risk? There's always risk in doing what's right. Samuel cut her off. That's what makes it worth doing. Within an hour, Margaret was riding toward the reservation with Dr. Harrison, her saddlebags full of supplies and her heart full of determination. As they rode, the doctor told her more about what they would face. The disease attacks the throat and breathing passages, he explained. The main thing is to keep them comfortable and make sure they can breathe. Sometimes we have to do a procedure to open the throat, but mostly it's a matter of nursing them through the fever and hoping their bodies can fight it off. The reservation was located in a valley about 10 miles from Samuel's ranch. As they approached, Margaret could see smoke rising from several small cabins scattered along a creek. The settlement looked peaceful from a distance, but she knew that inside those cabins families were fighting for their lives. Chief Running Bear met them at the edge of the settlement. He was a man of about 50 with graying hair braided down his back and eyes full of worry. Doctor, he said in careful English, thank you for coming back. We have lost 2 more since yesterday. This is Margaret O'Sullivan, Dr. Harrison said. She's here to help nurse the sick. Chief Running Bear looked surprised. A white woman comes to help us? If you'll have me, Margaret said simply. The chief studied her for a moment, then nodded. All help is welcome. My daughter, Little Star, she is very sick. The fever burns in her like fire. For the next 3 days, Margaret worked alongside Dr. Harrison and the tribal healer, a wise woman named Grandmother Moon. They moved from cabin to cabin, tending to the sick and trying to make them comfortable. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking. Margaret held children while they struggled to breathe, spooned broth into mouths that could barely swallow, and sat with frightened parents who didn't know if their babies would live through the night. But there were victories too. On the second day, a little boy named Swift Fox turned the corner, his fever breaking just as his parents had given up hope. An elderly woman who had seemed near death rallied and began asking for food. Each recovery felt like a miracle. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the strength and dignity of the people she was helping. Despite their fear and grief, they faced the crisis with courage. Families shared what little they had with neighbors. Older children helped care for younger ones. No one complained, even when the pain was clearly unbearable. On the third evening, as Margaret was changing wet cloths on Little Star's fevered forehead, the girl opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "Are you an angel?" she whispered in halting English. Margaret smiled back, tears running down her cheeks. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a friend." Little Star's fever broke that night, and by morning she was asking for her mother and wanting to sit up. Margaret hugged Grandmother Moon as they celebrated together, language barriers forgotten in their shared joy. "She will live," Grandmother Moon said in her accented English. "The spirits heard our prayers." "She's strong," Margaret agreed. "They all are." It was Dr. Harrison who finally insisted Margaret return to the ranch. "You've been here 4 days without proper rest," he said. "You'll make yourself sick if you don't get some sleep in a real bed." Margaret was reluctant to leave, but she had to admit she was exhausted. The crisis seemed to be passing anyway. No new cases had appeared in 2 days, and most of the patients were recovering. Chief Running Bear came to see her off personally. "You have a good heart," he told her. "You will always be welcome among our people." Margaret rode home as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. She was tired, dirty, and emotionally drained, but she felt more satisfied than she had in months. She had made a real difference in people's lives. As she approached the ranch house, she could see lamplight glowing in the windows. Samuel came out onto the porch as she dismounted, and before she could say anything, he was pulling her into his arms. "Thank God you're safe," he whispered into her hair. "I was so worried." Margaret closed her eyes and let herself lean against his solid chest. She could feel his heart beating rapidly, and she realized he had been truly frightened for her safety. "I'm fine," she murmured. "Tired, but fine." Samuel held her for a long moment before stepping back, his hands still on her shoulders.
"How are the patients?"
"Most of them are recovering. We lost 3 people total, but it could have been much worse." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "There was a little girl, Little Star. I thought we were going to lose her, but she pulled through." "You saved lives," Samuel said simply. "Dr. Harrison and Grandmother Moon did most of the work. I just helped where I could." "Don't diminish what you did," Samuel said firmly. "You risked your own life to help people who needed you. That takes real courage." Margaret looked up at him, seeing something new in his eyes, something that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Samuel," she began, but was interrupted by Catherine appearing in the doorway. "Margaret," Catherine called out, but she didn't come down from the porch. Catherine stepped out onto the porch, her pale blue dress rustling in the evening breeze. Margaret could see that she had been crying, but her chin was lifted with dignity. Samuel slowly released Margaret's hand and stood up, his face grave. "Catherine," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please let me speak first," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days, and I believe it's time for some honesty." Margaret felt her stomach twist with anxiety. She started to stand as well, but Catherine gestured for her to stay seated. "I came here expecting to marry a stranger and somehow make it work," Catherine continued. "I thought if we were both practical and kind to each other, we could build a decent life together. But these past weeks have shown me something I didn't expect." Samuel's hands were clenched at his sides. "Catherine, I owe you an apology. When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought, you thought you wanted someone like me." Catherine interrupted with a sad smile. "Someone who would fit neatly into your life without changing anything. And honestly, that's what I thought I wanted too. A nice, stable man who could give me security and a comfortable home." Margaret watched this exchange with growing dread. She could see where this was heading, and it made her heart ache for all 3 of them. Catherine walked to the porch railing and looked out at the darkening prairie. "But watching you 2 together has taught me something important. I've seen real love, and it's nothing like what we were trying to create." "Catherine," Samuel started again. "No, let me finish," Catherine said firmly. "Samuel, when you look at Margaret, your whole face changes. You become more alive, more yourself. And Margaret, when you talk about this ranch, about the work you do here, about Samuel, you glow like a candle flame. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't know what you mean. Catherine turned to face them both. Yes, you do. You're in love with each other, and anyone with eyes can see it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Samuel spoke. Catherine, I've treated you badly. You came all this way in good faith, and I've been distracted by your housekeeper? Catherine supplied with a wry smile. Samuel, I'm not angry. Well, maybe a little hurt, but not angry. Because the truth is, I don't love you either. Samuel looked startled. You don't? I barely know you. Catherine laughed, though there was still sadness in it. How could I love you? I was trying to convince myself that I could learn to love you. But I see now that you can't force those feelings. They either exist or they don't. Margaret finally found her voice. Catherine, I never meant for this to happen. When you arrived, I was prepared to step aside and let you and Samuel build a life together. I know you were, Catherine said gently, which only proves what a good person you are. But Margaret, you belong here in a way I never could. You love this land, this life, this man. You've made yourself indispensable not because you're trying to trap him, but because you genuinely care. Samuel stepped forward. What are you saying, Catherine? Catherine straightened her shoulders. I'm saying that I release you from any obligation to me. Our correspondence, our agreement, I consider it null and void. You're free to follow your heart. But what about you? Margaret asked, standing up. Where will you go? What will you do? Catherine's face brightened slightly. Actually, I've had some interesting conversations with Mr. Peterson at the bank. He's been very kind to me since I arrived, and he's asked if he might call on me. Samuel looked surprised. Henry Peterson? He's a widower, as you know, with 2 young children. He needs a wife who can help him in town, someone who understands business and social obligations, someone like me. Catherine's smile was more genuine now. We're much better suited than you and I ever were, Samuel. Margaret felt a wave of relief so strong it made her dizzy. Are you sure, Catherine? About Mr. Peterson, I mean. I'm sure. He's educated, well-established, and he appreciates the qualities I have to offer. More importantly, when he looks at me, I see genuine interest, not the polite kindness Samuel has been showing me. Samuel ran a hand through his hair. Catherine, I don't know what to say. I feel like I've wronged you terribly. You haven't wronged me, Samuel. You've actually done me a favor. If you had married me out of duty, we both would have been miserable. This way, we can all find real happiness. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of an approaching horse interrupted them. They looked toward the road and saw a rider coming fast through the gathering dusk. That's Mr. Peterson, Catherine said, sounding pleased. I sent word to him earlier that I wanted to speak with him about something important. Henry Peterson was a pleasant-looking man in his 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He dismounted and approached the porch somewhat nervously. Miss Catherine, he said, removing his hat. I got your message. I hope everything is all right. Everything is perfectly fine, Henry, Catherine said, and Margaret noticed she used his first name. I wanted to discuss a proposition with you. Peterson glanced uncertainly at Samuel and Margaret. Perhaps we should speak privately. Actually, I think Samuel and Margaret should hear this too, Catherine said. Henry, I've decided not to marry Samuel. Peterson's eyebrows shot up. Oh, well, that is, and I was wondering, Catherine continued with a mischievous smile, if you might be interested in courting me instead. Henry Peterson's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. Miss Catherine, that is, yes, I would be honored to court you. More than honored. Samuel stepped forward and extended his hand to Peterson. Henry, I think you and Catherine will be very happy together. Peterson shook Samuel's hand vigorously. Thank you, Samuel. I hope there are no hard feelings between us. None at all, Samuel assured him. In fact, I think you're getting the better end of this bargain. Catherine laughed, a sound of pure joy. Henry, would you like to sit with me for a while? We have a lot to discuss. As Catherine and Henry settled into chairs on the other end of the porch, Samuel turned to Margaret. Walk with me? He asked quietly. Margaret nodded, and they stepped down from the porch into the cool evening air. They walked in silence toward the barn, both lost in their own thoughts. I can't believe it's really over, Margaret said finally. When Catherine arrived, I thought, "You thought you'd have to leave," Samuel finished. "I was terrified you would." They stopped walking and faced each other in the moonlight. Samuel reached up and gently touched Margaret's cheek. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully." "I'm listening." "I love you," Samuel said simply. "Not because Catherine is leaving, not because it's convenient, but because you've become the most important person in my world. When you rode off to help at the reservation, I realized that nothing else matters if you're not safe and happy." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Samuel, I love your courage and your kindness. I love the way you make this house feel like a home. I love how you see the best in everyone, even people like Dutch and the folks at the reservation that others might dismiss. I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you read poetry in the evenings. I love you too," Margaret whispered. "I've loved you for months, but I never thought—" Samuel cupped her face in his hands.
Will you marry me, Margaret?
"Not because it's practical or convenient, but because we love each other and want to build a life together." "Yes," Margaret breathed. "Yes, of course I will." Samuel kissed her then, soft and sweet in the moonlight, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst with happiness. This was what love was supposed to feel like, not duty or settling, but joy and rightness and coming home. When they broke apart, they could hear laughter from the porch where Catherine and Henry were getting to know each other better. "I guess we should go tell them our news," Margaret said. "In a minute," Samuel said, pulling her close again. "I want to savor this moment a little longer." 3 weeks later, Cedar Falls had its first double wedding. Catherine married Henry Peterson in the morning, with Margaret as her maid of honor. That afternoon, Margaret and Samuel exchanged vows, with Catherine and Henry standing as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Samuel wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that reminded them both of the day they met. The ceremony was held in the small church with half the town in attendance. Chief Running Bear and several members of his tribe came to the wedding, bringing gifts of beadwork and blessing the union. Dr. Harrison served as Samuel's best man, and Dutch cried openly during the vows. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the ranch with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Margaret found herself thinking how different this was from the society wedding she would have had back east. This felt real and joyful and full of love. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Margaret and Samuel found themselves alone on their front porch once again. But this time Margaret was wearing Samuel's ring on her finger and the title of Mrs. Hayes. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked, pulling her close as they watched the stars come out. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Margaret replied. "Are you?"